If you've been following along in the study of the book of Esther, maybe you're wondering, how can I apply some of these biblical truths to my own life? Today, we're going to take a look at a few keys that we can use to unlock our own inner Esther to be best prepared for our own Esther moments. Let's take a look. Hey, what's up, friend? Welcome to Her Journey with God. I'm Sarah, and today we're taking a look at a few keys that we can use to unlock our own inner Esther, which means how do we personally apply biblical truths from the book of Esther to our lives to understand better how we should be living on a daily basis to make a difference in the world around us. But before we jump in, if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Please click the like and subscribe buttons and ring the notification bell so that you never miss the next episode. Today we're taking a look at several key qualities that Esther displayed in her own life that we can apply to our lives today, right now. Because I don't know about you, but if you've ever read the book of Esther, and especially in the in-depth study that we went through recently, you may have thought, well, good for her. You know, we often look at Esther as someone whose life is unattainable for us. But the reality is God calls each and every one of us to make a difference in the world around us. So no, my life will never look exactly like Esther's. God is probably not going to use me to save an entire group of people, but God does use us in practical ways on a daily basis in the world around us. And just like Esther was faithful in her own position, her own calling, exactly where God had placed her in that time period, we get the opportunity to be faithful in our time, our generation, our family, our friend group, our sphere of influence right here, right now. We are positioned for such a time as this. And so today we're going to take a look at just a few key characteristics that I found helpful as I read the book of Esther. And I really believe that as we apply these to our lives, we'll be better positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that do come up in our lives. So the first quality that I noticed was Esther's trust in God. Now, Esther didn't have an average upbringing. In the second chapter of Esther, we see that she was a Jewish orphan girl being raised in the land of her ancestors' captivity. Now, we don't know exactly when she lost her parents or what that situation looked like, but we also see her putting her trust in God in the midst of her situation. Esther trusts God with the details of her story, and it makes me think of the book of Acts in chapter 17, verse 26. It says, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place." God determined ahead of time the boundaries of our dwelling place and the time and place that we would be born into. It was no surprise to God that Esther was born in the land of her ancestors' captivity at the time when her Jewish people were going to be put in danger and that a plot was going to be brewed against them. We can trust that that's true for us today. God was not surprised when we were born into the generation and into the culture, the time, and the place that we were born into. None of it takes God by surprise, and we can trust God fully with the details of our lives. You know, in terms of the idea of Esther's backstory, I can really relate to what Esther might have thought about her upbringing. Maybe she wondered if God could really use her because of the fact that she was an orphan and she didn't have a normal childhood or a normal young adult period. Things were different for her. And, you know, honestly, I can relate to that. And I think we can all relate in some way. I was homeschooled until college. I never went to school. And so I often felt out of place. And in addition to that, I also built houses with my dad from a young age. I helped him on the job site whenever I wasn't doing schoolwork. My friends from church or my 4-H group were different than I was. They would play volleyball at their school, or they would wear makeup, or they just had a a totally different life than I did, even though we were friends. And so I often found it hard to relate to other young women my age, because while they were off doing something that seemed to be normal and fun, I was putting a roof on a house with my dad, or I was catching up on school over the summer because had been building a house with my dad. What I actually came to realize was that God helped me through that upbringing. I didn't have to deal with some of the issues that my friends who went to school dealt with, and it built in me a good work ethic where I learned how to work with my hands and to see the job through until it's done. And so God used my upbringing to shape me into who I am today. And I believe that was true for Esther as well, that God prepares us for whatever He calls us to do. He's at work in us, even in the backstory of our lives, even in those messy things that we wouldn't have chosen. It didn't seem like a good thing that Esther lost her parents, but in the grand scheme of things, while it may not have been ideal, God allowed it to happen. And perhaps it was for a reason that Esther was raised by Mordecai. Perhaps that kind of lifestyle that she grew up with shaped her into a young woman that she needed to be to fulfill God's purpose for her life. And so we can't discredit those areas of our lives that we would like to gloss over and forget that they ever happened. Sometimes it's those hard areas, those challenging areas that we've been through that God actually uses to fulfill His purpose in our lives. So number one is, don't forget to trust God with the details of your story, even the messy ones, because God is working all things out for your good, even the hard things. And so our definition of good might look different than God's. When we read the verse Romans 8:28 and hear that God is at work in all things, working all things for our good, we might think that that means He's working out an easy, comfortable life for us, but that's not the case. It actually means that even in the bad things, even in the hard things, God is working for our good. For some reason, somehow, He is making those hard things into good things for us in some way, whether it's shaping our character or pruning us or making us into someone that He knows He can use as a willing vessel. The next thing I want to talk about is Esther's humility, because this is something that's really important for us as Christian women to put into practice today. In every generation, humility is still so important. And it's not something that we see a lot of in the world today. Colossians chapter 3, verse 12 says, "Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience." We see that humility is something that Scripture tells us to put on, kind of like a garment. We can clothe ourselves with these virtues. We can put them into practice in daily life. And it's so important to practice humility so that we don't become prideful. And Proverbs chapter 18, verse 12 says, "Before destruction, a man's heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor." And if you followed along in the series on Esther, you saw that Haman in particular was full of pride and pomp and arrogance. And wow, did he surely find destruction as the fruit of his ways. But in contrast to that, we saw that Esther and Mordecai both were full of humility. And I think that this came out in several key ways in Esther's life. The first was that she was open to listening to advice. And I think it's our nature to want to figure things out on our own and say, "I've got this." But really, humility leans into the advice of other people. We see this in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15. It says, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice." Also, Proverbs 15:22, "Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors they succeed." Several times throughout this book, we saw Esther taking advice from wise people in her life. The first advice that she took was from Mordecai, who told her not to reveal her faith immediately. He said to keep that quiet, and she obeyed him. And we saw it later come out that it was for a time and a purpose, that her faith had been concealed until just the right time. And so Esther was very wise to listen to Mordecai. And we also see her listening to Haggai in taking advice on what she should take in with her as she goes for her first visit with the king. She listens to the advice, and because of that, she gains favor with the people around her. Now, we don't want to take advice from just anyone out there. There's a lot of people online, a lot of people calling themselves prophets, a lot of people offering self-help, and we have to be really careful and discerning who we take advice from. Even some friends and family members may have good intentions in giving us advice, but we still need to be really careful to discern whether that advice is helpful and wise, because we don't want to end up like the king, King Ahasuerus, who had Haman as his advisor. And look how that turned out. Haman was plotting against the Jews. He told the king that it would be a good thing to kill off the Jews in the land. And because the king didn't know any differently, he took Haman's advice and a plot was set against the Jews. And it was horrible advice. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals." We've got to be careful who we're listening to, who we're spending time with, because that will influence our life. Another aspect of Esther's humility is what we see as she approaches the king in his throne room. She doesn't barge in aggressively, pressuring him into doing anything. We see her putting on her best outfit and actually just standing quietly in his courtroom, waiting for him to notice her. Everything about her is more subtle, graceful, and full of patience and peace, and we don't see her trying to push her own way. But we also see humility before God, because she was taking a risk, putting herself out there, not knowing what was going to happen, even though it might cost her her life. So I really think that humility is an important aspect for us today. Another aspect of Esther's story that I want to talk about is her prayerfulness and fasting, because I really believe that prayer and fasting are critical for our lives as believers. So many times we find ourselves kind of in over our heads, right? In the situations around us, things that we don't know how to handle, situations that are unknown, our unknown future. We don't know how things are going to work out. And so it's really good that we prepare our hearts through fasting and prayer to be able to lay it at God's feet and trust Him with the outcome. In Esther chapter 4, verse 14, Mordecai says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai says, who knows if you've come to the kingdom for this time? Literally, they didn't know. They didn't really know exactly that God was going to show up. They didn't really know how the situation was going to turn out. And don't we all have those situations, whether it's a relationship, you don't know if you're going to break up, or you don't know if your marriage is going to hold together, or you don't know if your kid is going to get saved, or literally so many different areas of life we don't know the outcome to. And here Mordecai is saying, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And so it was the prayer and fasting that was the next step for them. Even though God's plan is often beyond our comprehension or our understanding, we don't get all the details. We don't know exactly what God is doing, but prayer and fasting brings us back to a place where we trust God with this situation, with the outcome, to where Esther was able to take her next step with boldness and faith and say, if I perish, I perish. I don't know what the outcome is, but I trust God that He is at work, and I'm going to leave it in His hands. I'm going to leave the outcome in His hands. I've had to do that in the past with breakups, not knowing how the next conversation was going to go. With someone that I was dating and not knowing how things were going to work out, I had to trust those things to God. Prayer and fasting puts our hearts back in the place where we can trust God with the outcome of our situations. And so those are three really big areas that I really believe we should put into practice as women, that we can put into practice, because while God may not use us to save the Jewish people or all the Christians in the world, He often has good plans for us us in our everyday lives. And as we practice these things, we put ourselves in the best position to make the most of those opportunities. And so let's do a quick recap. The first was trusting God with the details of our stories, because honestly, God's story is bigger than us. It was bigger than Esther, and we can't see how all of those details are working out when we're in that season of life. Sometimes we can look back on things and see how God worked it out, but often when we're in the middle of a chapter, a season of our lives, we can't see the next chapter or the next season. We don't know what's to come. So we've got to trust God with those things, and especially trust Him with the past, because if we can trust God with the future, we can trust Him with where we have been, our childhood, our young adult years, whatever we've been through. We can trust God with those details. The next thing is humility, being sure to not only be humble to listen to advice, but also humbling ourselves before the Lord and recognizing that sometimes what we want or our way of doing things isn't necessarily the best thing. And so if something we're struggling with in life doesn't line up with the Word of God, we've got to remember that God's way is the best way. If God says to be faithful or patient or persevering or whatever it is, we need to trust that God's way is best. And then we also need to be prayerful and even fasting. I know fasting for me is not very fun, and especially having been pregnant in the past or breastfeeding, going without food sometimes doesn't really work in some seasons of life, but there are different ways that you can fast. So it doesn't have to be just giving up all food, although that is an option, but it can be things like fasting coffee or fasting TV or fasting social media. So there are different things that we often rely on and get comfortable with, and we kind of lean on it as a crutch. It's our little comfort. And when we let go of that and give that up for a short season, we find greater dependence on God. Rather than going to that thing for comfort, we have to lean on God and trust Him for everything that we need. Friend, I hope this was helpful and encouraging and a good reminder to be cultivating the fruit of the Spirit, to be more focused on the inside of what God is doing inwardly, because as He is creating in us a deeper, stronger character, making us more like Christ, we're going to be more effective in the world around us. And God does want us to do good things in the world and to make a difference in the sphere of influence that we have. So I hope this was helpful and encouraging. God bless you.